And so we have a number of individuals like this, Irenaeus, Polycarp, Papias. And so they give us this unanimous confirmation within this early community, because it's not a very big community at this point, in saying, okay, well, we know who the authors of the Gospels are, and we have this direct chain of custody paper trail that goes back to the earliest Jesus community. And one of the criteria for deciding, okay, well, what goes in this group of documents, this testamentum, right? That's the word we get. So it's actually the word covenant. So in Greek, the word testament is diatheke, which is covenant. So it's the Old Covenant, New Covenant. In Latin, it's testamentum. So that's where we get Old Testament, New Testament. And they say, well, we know who the earliest Jesus community were. We know who were the disciples of Jesus. We know who the disciples of Jesus were. And so we can trace these back. So when other Gospels pop up, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, and they're analyzed, they know the people who are connected with this community. So they can look at the Gospel of Thomas and say, this isn't from Thomas. A, because we know people who know Thomas, and B, the content in it doesn't reflect anything accurate in its representation of either who the disciples were or who the Jesus who we know and have known from this community to be. And so when I talk about unanimous agreement on the Gospels, I'm talking about the earliest Jesus community that actually had a direct succession from either someone who knew Jesus or someone who knew Jesus. So we have this unanimous agreement on the Gospels, and we have this unanimous agreement on the letters of Paul, but we have some disagreement about some of the other books. If for no other reason, then there are a lot of books floating around with very distinct names on them.
Like the Book of Enoch, are you talking about? Like stuff like that?
No, that's actually previous. We can talk about that if you want.
Yeah. Well, let's not get you off topic, but we'll come back to that.
Yeah, so there are a lot of letters and writings with names associated with John and Peter. And so you have, we have a...
common name.
Yeah, right? Well, you have the Gospel of John, but then you have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and then you have the Acts of John, and you have the Revelation of John, and you have the Epistles of John. Like, you have to figure this out.
Yeah.
So there are some books where the church is like, okay, 24 of the 27, we can say we know where these come from. But we got to make sure we do our due diligence so that we're not recognizing books that are not an accurate representation of the actual authors. And so that's why it took the dust to settle a little bit more on 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, 1st and 2nd Peter, Jude, and James. Because they're like, we got to make sure these books are actually connected to the people whose names.
How did they do that?
The same way they did it with the other ones. So they looked back and looked at both the content and the provenance of the actual documents. So where are they being written? Who can we connect them with? Where are these documents coming from? And what communities are they coming out of? So there was no actual criteria for canonicity, but they did ask questions. And so these are in scholarship sometimes referred to as apostolicity, which is, does it have a connection with an apostle or someone who knew an apostle? Orthodoxy, which has nothing to do with the Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox Church. Orthos means right, and doxa means, in a number of its different semantic ranges, teaching. So orthodoxy means, does it reflect the right teaching in that the apostles established churches, and they've been teaching in the churches the things that have been handed down from those who Jesus gave the authority to teach. And so when we look at some of the content of these things, so for example, the last line of the Gospel of Thomas has Peter looking at Jesus and saying, hey, Mary's here. Get Mary out because women are not worthy of life. And so Jesus says, don't worry, I'm going to make her into a male that resembles you, male. And the last line of the Gospel of Thomas is, every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven.
Like transgenderism?
So I'm
fucking with you.
It's complicated, right? They were before their time, right? So the early church looked at this kind of content and they went, what is this?
Yeah.
Like, that's not, we know what the teaching of Jesus sounds like. It ain't that. And so they would both look at the content and look at the provenance in terms of the actual communities that they were coming out of. So you had apostolicity and you had orthodoxy, and then you also had the third criteria, which was Catholicity. Once again, nothing to do with Roman Catholics. Kata means concerning, and holos means the whole. Concerning the whole, universal church. And so they're saying, okay, is there enough unanimous agreement from the church universal, from the churches that were established by the apostles, that we can say these are being read widely within church communities that actually reflect a provenance of going back to the earliest Jesus community?
Right. Within those communities, though, but the thing I always worry about, and to be fair, I worry about this with everything. It's not just, we happen to be talking about Christianity right now, but I'd make the same argument for, or raise the same possibility, I should say, for literally anything that points to any form of religion or historical understanding of the history of the world. Like when you have call it closed-end community, you have a handful of people who are left behind after Jesus who knew him, who are to carry on his word as he wanted. As he would have wanted it. You have to understand that even if they may have been really stand-up people and done a good job, there's still a human bias that occurs where it's like, well, I'll take that, I'll take that.
Sure.
He wouldn't have minded, right? That could still happen, no?
Yeah. No, and I think that's a good observation from a lay perspective and from a historical perspective.
Yeah.
And one thing that's very unique about some of these documents is there's a criteria within historiography that's referred to as the criterion of embarrassment. And so the idea is if there is something within the writing that reflects very poorly on either the authors or the people connected with the authors, it is a good assumption to say that it is probably true. Not that it's always true, but that's probably true because you're not going to put your, right, this is what we were talking earlier about some of the perspectives of prophethood in Islam versus Christianity. My Muslim friends have a problem with the prophets looking as bad as they do in the Old Testament. Because they're like, a representation of a man of God wouldn't look like that.
And you and I were talking off camera about this earlier. Muslims view prophets as like a form of divine, like a form of relative perfection.
Or at least there's an understanding within, say, Sunni orthodoxy that I don't think it's not all Muslims, but sort of historical Sunni orthodoxy within Islam would largely have an understanding of prophets being close to sinless, if not sinless. And so if you have someone like King David, who in the Bible, he's a murderer, he's an adulterer, he sleeps with Bathsheba, and then Bathsheba's husband comes back from war.
Is this the same David with Goliath?
Yeah.
Well, he did kill Goliath.
He killed Goliath, but that was a good move, right? Yeah. So he kills Goliath, he goes on, he's a great king, but he always has this problem of he just loves the ladies too much. Right?
Nothing wrong with that.
So the story is he's standing on the roof. He sees Bathsheba. She's on her roof and she's bathing. And he's like, oh, I like that. And so he calls her and he sleeps with her. But her husband is fighting on the front lines for him. And her husband comes home and he's like, oh, this is a problem. So he tries to put her husband even more on the front lines so that he dies.
Please die.
And then he dies, right? And so he's like purposefully like micromanaging the death of this woman's husband so that he can basically, because she becomes pregnant and that's problematic because her husband's, he brings him back from war and wants her husband to sleep with her so that he might think that he got her pregnant. And he's such a devotee of David that he won't go home. He sleeps in front of the palace gate. Because he's like, my comrades in arms, they're out on the battlefields, they're in the trenches.
His wife's getting knocked up by the king. Yeah, oh my God. Yeah.
So all that to say,
shit.
From a historian perspective, we look at this and we're like, hey, this is like the good guy. David's the good guy. He's
Allegedly.
The king, right? But he is a bit of a scumbag. Like he does these things. So we can look at that and we can say, especially within the ancient Near East, you never make the king look bad. So in this regard, that's probably true. These events probably took place because you look at all of the other ancient Near Eastern, the Mesopotamian, the Egyptian kings, the pharaohs, and they're always going above and beyond to try to make them look good. And so in the criterion of embarrassment, when you look at something like the Gospels, what's really interesting is, so it's sometimes, I like to refer to it as the disciples because they're like not getting anything Jesus is saying. Jesus is like, hey, I'm teaching you these things. And they're like, oh, okay. Like they continually fail to understand what Jesus is saying. He's predicting his own death. He's literally saying, I will be handed over to the authorities and will die. And then when it happens, they're like, we didn't see this coming. And then they abandon him.
Yeah.
And then Peter, who's like, number 2 to Jesus, right? He's the person who at the Last Supper says, I will die with you. I will fight for you.
He's like, I'm going to deny you. You're going to deny me 3 times?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he does it.
Yeah.
And so.
Bad luck.
And what's interesting is that is particularly clear in the Gospel of Mark, which all the early eyewitness testimony dictates comes directly from Peter. So the Gospel of Mark portrays Peter kind of in the worst light. And if we're to trust the early source information, which I think we can, that's coming directly from Peter. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, looking at something like the criterion of embarrassment, this bodes well in that you would think that they would try to gloss over some of those things. That these people betrayed Jesus, that they denied Jesus, that they all ran away and they hid. Meanwhile, the women are like taking control. They're going to the tomb to.
Yeah.
So I totally agree with you that I think we really need to be careful of the fact that you have kind of mythological drift over time, and you need to be careful. However, there are criteria that we use as historians within the methodologies that we would look at any document to try to figure out, okay, how do we conclude, how do we make that, what I mentioned earlier, that inference to the best explanation, and weed out what is the reliable source information within this. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about the Gospels in particular is not only are they early, not only do they reflect eyewitness testimony, not only do individuals like Luke admit their blind spots and saying like, hey, don't confuse me for an eyewitness. I'm not an eyewitness, but I'm interviewing these eyewitnesses. And sometimes he names the people in a purposeful way to say like, hey, go ask.
You're right.
Go ask this person.
They're dead, but still ask them.
Well, they're alive at that point.
I'm kidding.
Yeah. But so we have these kind of levels of credibility that exist within something of the Gospels that when I do historical analysis with someone like Cassio Dio or Tacitus or Plutarch, I'm using the same kind of criteria that I would with the Gospels to try to figure out, okay, what can I deem as credible and what can I deem as not credible? And interestingly enough, the Gospels have a very high inference of this because I think the authors are going over and above to communicate what we're talking about. You can place within a time and a specific location, and there are people involved. Here are the names of some of the people. Go talk to them. They're still around. And so I think there is, we do need to be careful of mythological drift or embellishment, which I think we do see in some of the other Gospels.
How so?
The non-biblical Gospels. We see aspects of shoehorning of particular beliefs. So
What do you mean shoehorning?
So Jesus, the historical Jesus, is a first century itinerant Jew.
Uh-huh.
The Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, Peter, Judas, portray Jesus not as a Jew, but as a pagan mystic.
A pagan mystic?
Yes.
Like pagan towards what Roman paganism believed at the time, or just like
to a certain degree, in the sense of, so you and I, previous to recording, were talking about what's sometimes referred to as substance dualism in the ancient world, where they believe that the physical world is bad and the spiritual world is good. So there were groups, like there was a group called the Docetics or the Docetics. Dokein in Greek means to seem. So whereas some people today might have a problem with Jesus being God, in the ancient world, they didn't necessarily have that problem. They had a problem with him being man, like that he was a human was a problem. Because if Jesus is God, they're like, he can't be physical. Physical is bad. So they would strip that of him. And so this is particularly true in the Gospel of Peter, because the Gospel of Peter has a floating Jesus. He's a doketic Jesus. He's not actually there. And so in the instance of the crucifixion, Jesus is pretty chill because he's not even really being crucified. And so that is a pagan idea that comes from Platonic philosophy. that is written onto Jesus. And so from a historical perspective, is it more likely that the biblical Gospels portray Jesus as a Jew when really he was a pagan? Or is it more likely that Jesus, living in first century Judea, growing up in Nazareth, living in Galilee, and traveling in these areas, was a pagan?
Right. So you're saying all of the non-biblical Gospels portray him as pagan?
They have some aspect of pagan theology which is interwoven.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
So,
just like expand.
Right. So the Gnostics. So part of Gnosticism, you might have heard that category before. So Gnostics were, Gnosticism as a kind of Eastern ideological concept comes from the East and predates Jesus. The problem with the overarching concept of Gnosticism is that there isn't one group called the Gnostics. That's a modern category. There were like dozens of groups that we now call the Gnostics. So in one sense, it's a little bit academically problematic to just call them Gnostics.
It's putting everything in one basket.
Yeah. Nonetheless, if we're going to paint with a very broad brush.
That's fine. Yeah.
The Gnostics, if we can boil down the essentials, even though they all disagree with each other and contradict one another on multiple levels, believe in gnosis. Gnosis in Greek means knowledge. And the idea is that you have these divine figures which are imparting secret knowledge to particular people. And so Jesus in the biblical Gospels is very public with his ministry. He's preaching in public. He's telling parables, which, mind you, can be a little bit cryptic at times. But his actual overt ministry is very public in that way. He's preaching to literally thousands of people. The opposite is true in the Gnostic Gospels. Jesus is kind of covert, and he's whispering something into this person's ear, and he's whispering something into that person's ear, and he's trying to keep the secret knowledge close, and he doesn't want it to be, out there and to the public, and it's cryptic to the point of being illegible. So you read something like the Gospel of Phillip, and if you ever sit down and read the Gospel of Phillip, you find it doesn't make any sense. In fact, I've translated through the Coptic of the Gospel of Philip from the Nag Hammadi library, and it's even hard to translate sometimes because the words seem like they don't fit. Like they say things and you're like, I don't know what this means. I don't understand. I'm translating it as it looks, but it's illegible. And that's on purpose. Because the idea is if you're enlightened, if you realize that it's not that Jesus is divine, but actually you're divine, and you realize your divinity, you unlock that by this gnosis, this secret knowledge. And so this is very different than what we see in either anything that resembles Judaism or anything that resembles what I would say is traced back to the historical Jesus. So it has these kinds of ideas that are more palatable for, say, a Roman pagan audience. They would have had no problem with these ideas. Whereas a lot of the things Jesus is saying are kind of antithetical to common understandings within broader Roman paganism.
All right, real quick, I just have to go to the bathroom, but I want to ask you how they're antithetical right when we get back. So let's put a pin in that. And I have you throughout the day today, so we're definitely, this is so interesting, man. You're doing a great job. We're definitely going to do a Patreon episode as well. So we'll do this, and then we'll have some more content there, and the Patreon link will be linked in description. But one sec, we'll be right back.
Yep.
All right, we're back. So you were going to talk about why it was antithetical to broader Roman paganism and expand upon that.
Yeah. So what you have in an understanding of Jewish and Christian, what's sometimes referred to as atonement, right? How do you become right with God? In ancient Judaism, you have the sacrificial system that's set up in the temple. And so in the Levitical law, you have in the book of Leviticus, sandwiched right in the middle between the two holiness codes, you have Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, right, where they would make this sacrifice on behalf of the nation and the peoples, the surrounding nations. And so there was always this understanding that salvation was something done to you on the basis of God's work. However, in paganism, that was not a concept, right? Salvation is not something done to you. Salvation is something that you can attain on your own. So
within you.
Yeah. And so the Gnostics in particular capitalize on this, where, like I said before, it's not just that Jesus is divine, it's that you're divine and you unlock this divinity through the secret knowledge. So this is not something that would have been compatible with either ancient Judaism or particularly Christianity, because the whole message of Christianity was you can't do it. You are unable to do it. The wages of sin is death, but Paul says the gift of God is eternal life. And salvation is something that's done external to you based on the finished work of Christ on the cross. But that's not what we get within these other gospels. We get something very different, which strips down Jesus to a very simplistic kind of pagan philosopher, rather than being a Jewish rabbi who's steeped in the Judaism of his day, but then incorporates and fulfills these ideals and messianic expectations.
So let's bring this back to the Council of Nicea.
Yeah.
Because what and this is really good background you've given, but what you've been talking about is how kind of like within the early church itself, they worked out what's there and what's not. But what you had said at the beginning of this, when we were talking about the council, was that none of this, as far as like the Roman Empire goes, they just kind of took what the church was doing on the text. So the quote unquote banned gospels was some of the problems that you had within them, as far as like whether they had paganism aspects or whatever. Like they just put those to the side on the recommendation of the early church.
Well, sort of. Sometimes it's portrayed as if there is like these dozens of groups which we categorize as Gnostics, which are really, a dispersed group. They contradict each other. They have their individual, right? Jesus is either whispering into Mary's ear, or he's whispering into Peter's ear, or he's whispering into Philip's ear. The things that are said about these particular people are contradictory within each of these documents. They don't even agree on what everyone else is saying. But they're also not very popular, and they're really only delegated to specific places at specific times. So by the time the Council of Nicea rolls around, Gnosticism and all these different groups have really had their heyday. They're almost dying out. Now, a lot of these Gnostic groups end up surviving past Christianity, and past the Council of Nicea in particular.
Oh, yeah.
But right in the Middle Ages, right? You have the Cathars.
We're going to get to that. Yeah.
Okay, but by the time of the Council of Nicea, they're almost exclusively dead. So it's not even really in contention. And these other writings, where the difference of having, dozens of copies of the 27 books of the New Testament all over the ancient world, hundreds, if not thousands, by the time you get to the 3rd, 4th century, you really only have maybe a few copies of the Gospel of Thomas in an isolated area within Upper Egypt. You might have the Gospel of Peter in a particular area of Egypt. You might have some of these other documents, but they're not nearly as prolific, and they're really isolated to particular areas. So the New Testament scholar Larry Hurtado, who has now passed away, but he did a really good job of sort of tracking this information. Him and there's another guy, F.F. Bruce, who wrote a book on the canon of Scripture. And they both talk about the fact that whoever these Gnostics were, they were neither popular nor prolific within the ancient world in comparison to broader Christianity. So the Council of Nicea is called. It's called because Constantine decriminalizes Christianity, and he sees, okay, now we have Christians coming out of the woodwork. Now, some historians have said that there are as high as 60 to 70% of the Roman Empire being Christian at that time. I do not think that the evidence bears that out. I think it's a lot lower than that. With all due respect to the people who say that it is.
Based on what evidence, though?
What evidence? Based on the Christian communities that we can both look at in terms of the written documentation and where it's coming from, and based on the previous persecutions, as well as the actual physical evidence archaeologically of things like early Christian communities. They did things differently. They communed differently. And so I think it's far more likely that number is closer to like 15%, and I think that that's pretty high either way, but they're everywhere. Christians are everywhere. And I think that's what's more important. And Constantine is not seeing this as a power grab as much as he's seeing this about the Pax Romana, the peace of the empire. He doesn't want people disagreeing, and he wants to make sure that people are living peaceably. And so he sees this disagreement, which is kind of escalating in the church communities, and he implores the religious officials, the bishops, and the traditional number is that there are 318 people who show up at the Council of Nicea. I think the number is realistically way higher than that because they would come not just the bishop would come like with a like a community. There'd be church leaders.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, the Bishop of Rome, the quote unquote Pope, doesn't show up. He doesn't seem to have any kind of overarching responsive power at this time. He sends 2 delegates, but none of the documentation that comes out of the Council of Nicea indicates that the Bishop of Rome in particular had any more or less authority than any other bishop across the Christian empire. And at this point, saying Christian empire is anachronistic because there wasn't a Christian empire yet. But they get together, and remember that this is immediately after a pretty stringent era of persecution. So there are people showing up to Nicea who have lost limbs for the confession of their faith. And so this idea that you kind of get from the DaVinci Code, that this is where the divinity of Christ is decided. I mean, if that were truly the case, and Constantine says, okay, I'm going to get you all together, and now you're going to believe this. I know you might believe something else, but you're going to believe this now. Well, there are people showing up who are like, I'm sorry, we were willing to die before. Why would we just go along with you now?
But there was, and to be clear, like the Da Vinci Code also fictionalizes a lot of things because it's a story for sure. Like there's certainly great aspects of history within that Dan Brown puts within that, but there's also things that are, for the story. That said, there is some kind of compromise though, right? Because I'm just thinking like, let's say the people, especially the ones who are showing up without limbs because they've been so strong about their faith, they've literally lived under the tyranny of their faith being persecuted literally physically upon them, say nothing of emotionally and spiritually, by this empire. And now suddenly this empire is saying, hey, not only is that going to stop, but we want to include, like the emperor himself wants to meet with you guys to discuss a way forward for your religion. Isn't there certainly a possibility that maybe some simple compromises are therefore then made at that meeting, such as maybe what dates they choose to put certain holidays on that may have matched previous things that the Romans did under their pagan religion and stuff like that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's not a question of possibility. Almost everything is possible. It's a question of probability. And so at this point, you already have the fact that Christianity was decriminalized over a decade before.
Right. 312.
So you already have 10 plus years of kind of Constantine showing his cards. He converts in that time. And I actually think, based on how it is described, that his conversion was legitimate. I think he actually believed, because part of that is that it was at great detriment to his actual political power.
It was.
Yeah.
Well, because this small percentage. Yeah, you're right.
Well, and remember, before that, the way that Diocletian got away with what he did is by literally making himself the god.
Right.
And the Roman populace were fine with that. The imperial religion was actually not something they ever had a beef with. And so if Constantine really wanted to grab at power, he could just make himself a god again. Or he could continue on in sun worship, which he was basically doing. He could continue on in Sol Invictus, in worshiping the sun as Saturn, as God. And that would have been completely both acceptable and understandable. In fact, part of the debate about early Christians and some of the accusations that were lobbed against them is that they were atheists in that they denied the gods. So A being the negative participle, and then theos meaning God, right? Not that they didn't believe in any god, but that they didn't believe in the gods, and that they were called antisocial because the religious festivals and going-ons in the Roman Empire were inherently religious.
Ah, yes.
So they were atheists and they were antisocial. If Constantine wanted to sort of continue with the status quo, he totally could have, and it would have actually made him look way better in the eyes of the populace, of most people who were still practicing Roman paganism. And so his conversion is not actually a very strategic move in terms of his political power. Now, I think it ends up being better for him in the end, but he's still on the fence about a lot of things. But at this point, by the Council of Nicea in 325, he's already, at least to some degree, to the Christians, shown, okay, I'm not going to kill you guys. I'm going to decriminalize this. And it's actually said that he commissions copies of the Bibles to be both produced and to be spread around. And this is very expensive, like to the tune of what would be millions of dollars today.
Yeah.
I mean, we have what we think are some of those. So there's a document called Codex Sinaiticus that's at the British Library right
what's
now.
this?
So this is one of our earliest examples of what we would consider a Bible. So before this, you had individual books. So you have manuscripts that float around from the 2nd, 3rd centuries of, say, the Gospels or the letters of Paul or these documents. But they're independent largely. So they're specific manuscripts. And there's a categorization system for this. In fact, if you look up csntm.org.
CSN, N is in Nancy?
Yeah.
NTM?
Yeah.
.org. Okay, let's pull it.
So that's the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. So this is done by Dan Wallace. So if you click Digital Manuscript Collection, so this organization goes around the world and they try to preserve manuscripts. So what you can actually do is you can go over to the classification on the left-hand side, go down, click papyrus, and then say start in 2nd century and in 3rd century. And then you can even scroll down and be a little bit more choosy. So you can say, I just want, so you go, let's say the book of, go the Gospels, because you'll get the highest percentage of that. And then you have them listed. So you can view, so let's scroll down and go to a key example. Go to P66 on the main body.
Oh, on the main body.
Yeah. Okay. So if you scroll down, so this is the numbering system. So P66 right there, not that one, go back.
Okay.
Go to the second one, P66, 2nd, 3rd century. So this is a copy of the Gospel of John.
Whoa.
And so this is what they would have looked like. So this one is actually in Geneva, Switzerland, at the Bodmer Foundation. And this is one of our
early... what?
The Bodmer Foundation. So it's just an institution. So this is one of our earliest examples of a cover-to-cover. I actually have a full facsimile of this in my office that I do academic work on.
Is this written in Aramaic?
So this is Greek. Yeah. So if you look at it, you can actually click it and it'll get close.
Get a magnifier.
Yeah. Woo, that's pretty close. So you have there.
Oh, yeah, that is Greek.
Yeah.
Holy shit.
So the first line, scroll to the top.
The very first line of this?
Yeah.
You can read ancient Greek, right?
Yeah. So, and arche and halagos and kai halagos and proston theon. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So I actually have a video on my YouTube, shameless plug, where I work through the first 2 pages of this document, and I site translate it, and I explain the syntax and the grammar and what it says.
Whoa.
Because the interesting thing about this is where there's a lot of manuscripts have differences within the manuscripts for various reasons. Scribes make mistakes. Scribes insert things. There are hundreds of thousands of these. But the interesting thing about the preface to John's Gospel is this reads exactly like a modern translation. So when I translate through verses 1 to 14, verses were added later in the 16th century, but the equivalent of verses 1 to 14, it reads exactly identical to what we would have with no not even issues with spelling or word order or anything. It's very, very interesting.
And you were telling me off camera that in ancient Greek, the way that sentences are structured, it didn't matter the order they put it in. I think an example you gave is I went to the club with Bill, and they might say club I went Bill with, or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's how it translates, but you're supposed to then figure out that it means...
Well, when you would translate it out from the Greek, you would put it in the proper word order in English. So you could have it in any word order in Greek as long as the right syntactical and grammatical structures are there, but it would translate out to the exact same thing.
Okay.
And this is, so the earliest manuscripts in ancient Latin and Greek and Coptic are this, which is called Scriptio Continua. So it's all capitals, no spaces in between words, and little to no punctuation. So in my doctoral work, in my PhD research, what I do is I study scribal habits and I study what are called paratextual features.
You study scribal habits.
Yeah, ancient scribal habits is my area of expertise.
What does that mean?
So all the people who copy the documents have these like little idiosyncrasies that they develop. So like if you zoom in, pull it up a little bit. So you'll see a dot right there between the final sigma and the omega, or the omicron right there. Yeah, so that is essentially a verse divider. Now, at this point, verses didn't exist, but P66 is a good example of a manuscript that was produced probably for public reading. In fact, my doctoral research, what I'm trying to prove is that the vast majority of these documents were produced for public reading, because it's Christians who start to develop things within ancient Greek like punctuation and spacing and paragraphing, and that's because they were reading these out loud.
Christians did that.
Yes. And when Christianity is decriminalized and Constantine produces these Bibles, other scribes, non-Christian scribes, actually start looking at this stuff and they say, hey, that's a lot easier to read. And they start copying how the Christians have done it all the way along.
Now, you were telling me, I'm going to get the names wrong here. I think it was earlier in the podcast or right before camera that it was Socrates who said you shouldn't write things down because you won't have a good memory of it.
It would make people lazy.
Yeah, exactly. You'd make people lazy. So they're taking the opposite end here, Christianity, essentially.
Oh, yeah. Christianity was inherently... And Christianity is interesting because literacy in the ancient world, there was a very established book trade, but it was almost exclusively rich, upper class, educated males. A lot of the Christian...
You don't say.
I know, right? A lot of the Christian community were not any of those things. A lot of them were women. A lot of them were not educated. And a lot of them were lower, what we would consider lower middle class.
A lot of them were women?
A lot of them were women.
Why?
In fact, Cicero, who is a philosopher, he critiques Christianity. And he calls it specifically the religion of the foolish, religion of slaves, women, and children. And the reason for that was because that was a group of people within the ancient world who did not have any agency. So,
of course, yeah.
Christianity comes along, and Paul says things like, in Christ there is no Jew nor Greek. There is no male nor female. There is no slave nor free. There is no and he says Scythian or barbarian. So he has like categories of social class, gender, what I essentially call ethnicity and religion. He says, hey guys, you're all one in Christ. And this paradigm breaks through the narrative of ancient Rome. And it's very countercultural. And that's why Cicero looks at this and he mocks it. Not that Christianity was all slaves, women, and children, but that they were giving any agency and credibility to slaves, women, and children, people who weren't even considered human in some regards.
Now, why? That's interesting, though. Let's just focus on the women aspect of it real quick. This is a church that ends up being built upon all males controlling it, and yet a lot of the following was women.
Yes.
That's a very interesting paradox there, if you will.
Yeah, so there's there's definitely a church hierarchy and structure that exists. However, it also has the ideal that everybody, irrespective of your gender, is created in the image of God. So male and female are both created in the image of God. Now, when it says that in the beginning of the book of Genesis, that is also countercultural because in the ancient Near East, if you read things like the Sumerian king lists or the Enuma Elish or some of the Sumerian tablets, they specifically refer to royalty being created in the image of God, but not everybody is created in the image of God. And they have a hierarchy. Right?
Cherry picking it.
Yeah, and there are different, so there's often parallels drawn between the Code of Hammurabi and the Levitical law. And I think some of those parallels are totally legitimate in the sense that you have these two ancient Near Eastern societies who exist alongside one another. And so you would expect to see parallels. And you would expect to see things like, hey, murder is bad. Because I think we can largely agree that that's true. Where it goes different is saying, no, it's not just royalty that are created in the image of God. Everybody is created in the image of God. And actually, the Levitical law says that there is no hierarchy in the punishment. Whereas in the Code of Hammurabi, there's a different penalty depending on where you are in the social structure. So if if you're upper class and you commit a crime against another upper class person, there's a different level of penalty than if you're upper class and you commit a crime against a slave.
Its own type of caste system, if you will.
Yeah. So coming back to this, because that was a bit of an aside.
Yeah.
So this is what largely, if you had a copy of the Gospel of John, it would look like this. This is a codex. Another interesting thing about Christianity is that Christians didn't invent the book, what we would call the codex, but they were the ones who pioneered it as a writing format.
They perfected it, if you will.
Well, the ancient world preferred scrolls. So Christians almost unanimously use codices, and we're not sure why.
Can you explain to people the codicy aspect there?
So a codice is just a book. Like you would take, instead of taking a long line of papyrus and writing on it and then rolling it up,
so
you
looks
would
like this instead.
Yeah, you would bind it on one side and you would write on both sides of the papyrus.
And this is long before the printing press and everything. So this is physical writing.
Yeah. And so this is much more analogous of what people would be considering when they were thinking of Scripture. When they were thinking of the Bible, so the word biblos is simply the Greek word for books. So it's plural. And then eventually it was the book, right? Because for a period of time in the Middle Ages, the only book you might ever have seen in your life was the Bible. But when they refer to the Scriptures, they're not thinking of a single bound volume like we would today. We just sort of, we revert to that because that's sort of in our conscious imagination. When we think of the Bible, we think of it, you have the King James with the leather cover on the, and, maybe thumb indexing on the pages, right?
Right.
But it didn't fall out of the sky like that. A lot of them were independent written documents like this. Now, Constantine commissions, to great expense of the Roman Empire, a number of what we would then consider as more of a Bible, Genesis to Revelation. So if you look up...
Did he commission that at Nicea?
No, previous to this.
Previous.
Yeah. Almost as like a peace offering to like, hey, Christians, I'm on your side. But if you look up Codex Sinaiticus.org.
Codex?
C-O-D.
How do you spell Sinaiticus?
So it's Codex with an X. I think you got it. Yeah, codexsinaiticus.org. The British Library, once again, something went wrong.
All right, hold on, let me Google it. Codex Sinaiticus. Let's see this.
Yep, that's it.
All right, cool.
So you can click, see the manuscript at the top. So this is put on by the British Library. And then... So Genesis is not a very good example. So the thing with codexes is that the front and the ends are very vulnerable.
Yeah, what are we looking at right here?
Yeah, we're looking at Genesis chapter 21. So this is all that survived of that section.
That's all that's left?
Yeah.
So did people fill in the blanks with what they thought it said?
I mean, we have tons of these manuscripts. So the answer is both yes and no. So we have both Codex Sinaiticus, and then we have also a number of other ones. But this is probably, you can also, so click at the top, Genesis.
Where does it say that?
So right up, choose a passage, it says, just above there.
Oh, got it. Yeah.
So go up, click Genesis, go down all the way, and go to Matthew.
Okay.
It's going to look a lot nicer than...
Oh, yeah, that's clean.
Yeah, so, and then you can even look, so what they've done is you can actually go to chapter and verse. And then they have it on the side, right? So they have the transcription in what is a modern Greek script, and then the translation on the bottom. Right. They've done a pretty good job. And you can zoom into this, and you can look at the different aspects. This is another document that I work pretty often with. Interestingly enough, when Billy Carson refers to the Sinai Bible, he's talking about this.
When he said, is that the whole thing where he talks about Jesus going to the pyramids and shit?
No, he says that the crucifixion is not in the Sinai Bible. And he credits this as one of, if not the earliest Bibles.
And you're saying this is the same thing?
I'm saying this is not just the same thing, but this reads exactly like your copy of the Gospel of Matthew today.
And it says the opposite of what he's saying.
It says what any other Bible translation you're going to work with. So,
and you can find that through this Codex Sinaiticus.
Yeah, you could just go to chapter and verse and read through it. Nonetheless, we're pretty sure this is one of the Bibles that Constantine commissioned, based on the dating of it.
Why are we only... Oh, so we're just doing it based on the date. That's why we don't know for sure that he said we're doing this.
Well, no, we have his decree that he did this.
But not for this one necessarily.
No, he doesn't so this one, we kind of conclude based on its dating and based on just how expansive it is. So this book would have taken 360 sheep to make. It would have been exorbitantly expensive. So based on the fact that we know that A, Constantine commissioned these Bibles to be produced, and B, that he did so at great expense, this is what it would have looked like. So this is one of the clearest examples because we can actually like walk through the text. But there are other ones. In fact, there's one that's here in the States, Codex Washingtonianus, which is in it's in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. We have Codex Alexandrinus, which is another one that comes from this time, and Codex Vaticanus, which is in the Vatican Library. And so all of these documents...
Have you ever been there?
The Vatican? No, I haven't.
Okay.
But interestingly enough, it was like you couldn't see Codex Vaticanus. It was like they're very like choosy with who could and couldn't go see it. And then 5 years ago, they digitized the whole thing. And they allowed people in. So I actually know people personally who have had access to the Vatican Library to look at Codex Vaticanus in person. But you have these examples.
And they say what's online matches up?
Oh, yeah.
That's good.
Pictures. Yeah.
Shout out to the Vatican on that one.
I know, right? So we have these examples of what are probably, like we can't say with 100% certainty, but based on the fact that these are pretty, A, they're professionally done, and B, this would have been like way beyond the scope of any, even a rich person at this time, to annihilate an entire flock of sheep simply to make a Bible. Like, it makes sense that based on the dating of these, that it was probably part of this commissioning by Constantine. So this is all in the intermediary period leading up to. So in terms of your question of why would they trust Constantine, I think Constantine had actually done a pretty good job of proving, both with his actions and with his words, although not perfectly, that he was a genuine believer, and that when he calls the bishops to get along at the Council of Nicea, and it's also important to keep in mind that he's not actually part of the proceedings. He says, hey, I want you to get along. And then he backs off. And one of the reasons we're pretty confident that that is the case is because emperors like to take credit for all sorts of things.
You don't say.
And if he, yeah, I know, right? No politician does that today. Wait, are you telling me the politicians like to take credit for things?
Listen, I didn't say anything.
I don't know if I can believe that in this day and age. And he doesn't. We have no record of him taking credit for anything. In fact, we have record of him specifically backing off and letting the proceedings of the council take place. And then the Council of Nicea was specifically to address this issue of Arianism, where Arian and his followers were saying the specific line is, there was a time when the sun was not. Now, there's a story that's very fun, but it doesn't actually come from this time. It comes from later.
Okay.
That St. Nicholas...
Like Santa Claus?
St. Nicholas, yeah, because he's from Myra in Turkey. He is a
Santa's Turkish.
He's a 4th century bishop.
No shit.
So the story is, although keep in mind, this is a little bit apocryphal coming afterwards. When Arius says there was a time when the sun was not, St. Nicholas stands up and punches him in the face.
That's bad Santa.
Isn't that a fun story?
Yeah.
It's probably not true.
I want that to be true.
But you can find Eastern Orthodox icons of St. Nicholas hitting
Love
Arius.
that.
Yeah.
All right. A little humanity there, you know. You gotta get the energy out sometimes.
Yeah, so that was the major issue. The major issue was, hey, we got to sort out this thing because we have a pretty articulate theology on how the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit operate within the one being of God. And what you're saying does not adhere to what actually Scripture articulates on that. The secondary issue, and you're exactly right in terms of saying that there were some dating issues in regards to holidays. The secondary issue was the date of Easter. When do we celebrate Easter based on what we see from some of the descriptions of when it could have been within the Gospels?
Yeah, they need a set date on that. Every year that pisses me off. It's like, is it going to be April? Is it going to be March? Is it that week? Is it? You know what I mean?
Well, it's based on the Jewish calendar, is why.
Yeah. Set date.
Yeah, fair enough. But that was the main issue. So the Council of Nicaea had nothing to do with any books of Scripture, and it had nothing to do with establishing any actual doctrine that wasn't already believed, but it addressed a theologically problematic belief that was becoming popular that was not in line with what Scripture actually articulated. But they quote Scripture within the documents that come out of Nicaea, which includes the Nicene Creed, which sort of the bare minimum of what every Christian denomination.
What's that? Like the I believe in one God, the Father Almighty.
No, that's the Apostles' Creed.
Oh,
although I'm impressed that you know that. Yeah.
I was right. It's somewhere floating around in there.
Yeah. No, the Nicene Creed is a little bit more wordy than that.
Okay.
But they come up with that, and then they come up with 40 kind of statements that come out of that in a letter. So we actually have the actual documentation. It's not hard to figure out what Nicaea was actually about. We have the receipts from what actually took place. So that's why when you have something like Dan Brown's DaVinci Code, and he's saying that all sorts of things took place, every scholar on planet Earth who had ever even done a cursory glance at Nicaea was like, hold on, like this is pretty easily demonstrated to be not just not the case, but like way off on a different universe.
Yeah, again though, but that's like, I said this earlier, but I didn't realize like people were taking all that seriously. Maybe I'm like really naive on that. But
They
like,
do.
It's also, he wrote a fictional story based on some truth, but like, of course it's not all exact. Like if you're getting the Council of Nicaea history from Dan Brown, that's not Dan Brown's fault. That's your fault.
You would be surprised. We shouldn't be.
Yeah, I want to get Dan Brown in here badly, like at some point. So I'd love to ask him about that.
I mean, Dan Brown in the preface to the book says that the narrative is not true, but that the details are true. So
all of them?
Well, he claims that a lot of the things are actually representative of what took place in terms of this idea of Jesus being married, drawing from the Gospel of Phillip and other things.
I think that now I'll say on that. Not a scholar.
Yeah.
Look around on that. But I think there's an interesting story there for sure. I do think that there's no doubt in my mind that there was some sort of tacit agreement or straight up, if you want to say like conspiracy, to devalue Mary Magdalene and therefore devalue any feminine influence within the church. Not to say the church should be like feminine or something. I don't think it should be masculine or feminine. I think it should be a fucking church. But to paint, because we kind of got off this, so maybe it's a good time to come back to that. Mm-hmm. To paint her as a prostitute, which is like the lowest.
So that is incorrect. So she wasn't a prostitute in the Gospels. So that's actually a mistake from
incorrect?
a pope. Because there are two stories. There's one story of a prostitute who comes to Jesus, and there's another story of Mary Magdalene. And they get conflated. But they're not the same story. So there's actually a pope. His name eludes me at the moment. But there's a pope at a certain point in time who specifically in, I can't remember if it was a sermon or a letter he wrote or a commentary, he conflates the two. But in the Gospels themselves, Mary Magdalene is never described as a prostitute.
Okay. But, and I'll take your word for that. You know a lot more about this than I do. Either way, they also paint her as not, her gospel's not accepted. Her gospel's an interesting story. She's therefore not involved with the church, and they paint her as, you know, just someone who was kind of around Jesus' life or whatever. And they made this is what's always kind of fucked with my head. The church puts this thing on sex, right? Mm-hmm. You have to wait till you're married. It's like this holy, sacred union, whatever. It's run by a bunch of dudes who don't have sex, though, unless it's the Catholic Church, in which they have some illicit sex with little boys. But I'm saying, like, it's run by people who then say, oh, we're not going to do that. We're going to be chaste and whatever. And Jesus, I think there's some talk where he talked about, like, I'm paraphrasing here, but, like, I come from the Father, so I'm married to heaven or whatever rather than flesh on earth or something like that. But, like, what would be so, like, it seems like the church established at some point, like early on after Jesus' death, the early Christians established that he was this celibate, godlike figure who did not commit the sin of having sex on earth and wasn't married. Why is that so important? I think it's kind of weird that again, if he's divine, maybe it's not weird, but like on the surface, it's like a 33-year-old dude back then, which is like you're fucking 50, isn't married and doesn't have kids. That would be an oddity, if anything. Like, why is that such an important part of the Christian church? Frankly, I've always thought that's like very stupid. It's just my opinion. But like, why is that like a critical part of the teaching, and then makes like sex this thing, when in reality, by making sex this thing that's like a no, everything's about sex. We call her the Virgin, we call her the Virgin Mary. We talk about the celibate Jesus, the celibate, like they're making it about sex. You see like the paradox, almost the catch-22 in their wording there?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an imbalance that has taken place in terms of maybe the communication of what sex is. I mean, ultimately, sex within Christian and Jewish heritage is a sacred thing. It is a beautiful thing. It is something that God designed. I mean, arguably the first mandate that God gave humanity was be fruitful and multiply. Like, this is something, but the cultural, or not cultural, the covenantal understanding of what sex is that it exists within the parameters of something that is holy. In terms of the union, the first covenant was marriage in Genesis, and sex operates within the bounds of what marriage is. Now, the whole issue of celibate priests aside, I'm not a Catholic. I don't think the celibacy in the priesthood was ever a good thing or even a biblical thing.
That's right.
As a Protestant, I believe in the priesthood of all believers. So we don't have that.
Yeah.
And we don't have that because I think that is both incorrect and problematic.
And I agree with you, but also, as you said earlier, to the credit of Protestantism in this case, you guys branched off and took away some things like that, which is great. But you still descend from the people who created that religion, who that was like a part of it.
Sure. I mean, in terms of the status of women, I would actually say the inverse is true, is that, you have this cultural expectation in Greco-Roman antiquity where there is no natural way in classical Latin to say male virgin, because the idea of a male virgin was not a thing. Okay. From an early age, you would have been expected as particularly a Roman male, like a citizen, but not exclusive to that, to have sex with whoever you want, whenever you want, at any time.
Okay.
That would be the expectation. On the inverse side, there are 25 ways to say female prostitute in Latin, because there is this understanding that males, chastity is not a thing. However, you want to be married to a chaste woman. And the women were actually held to a higher standard, and prostitutes were looked down upon, although there is this category of priest prostitutes within the religious system, where you could go and sleep with a priestess, and that would be part of a worship ceremony.
A priestess.
Yeah. Like in, say, the Temple of Athena, the temple prostitutes were a common thing. But nonetheless, Christianity comes along following Judaism, which has this idea of the sacredness of sex, that sex is something that's beautiful, that's ordained by God for a specific purpose in a specific time for the normative function of both marriage and procreation, but not limited to that. Because you have the book Song of Songs or Songs of Solomon in the Bible, which is basically a giant love poem from Solomon to his lover. Like, that exists within the Bible. It's a thing. Sex has and always will be a beautiful thing within Judeo-Christianity. Now, that goes awry when we try to make it into something where we almost over-sexualize everything.
Yes.
And then if everything is sexual, then it's almost like nothing is sexual.
Yeah.
And I do agree with you in the sense that I think that is problematic. However, Paul then comes along and he actually says, husbands, you need to look after your wife and sacrifice yourself for your wife like Christ did for the church. And Christ died for the church. And Paul actually holds men to the same standard that women are held to within the Roman ethic, and says, no, you can't just go around and sleep with anybody you want. You need to hold to the sacredness of this institution that is going to sit at the bedrock of humanity, in that the first creation mandate was be fruitful and multiply. And so once again, that was seen as countercultural and actually held men to the same agency that women were held to in that day, which was seen as very feminizing to the Romans. They looked at Christianity and they said, this is at minimum, it's stupid.
Yeah.
But what all of this does, going back to what I was saying about Cicero in chastising Christianity as the religion of women, is because women started to both be given agency and be given an ability of equality within Christianity. And there are some interesting studies that have been done where you can track the agency and rights of women across the ancient world, and it's exactly correlative to Christian missionaries going in previously. So Christian missionaries go into an area, and 5 to 10 years later, the agency of women and them actually being seen in some instances as actually human starts to pop up. And it's because Christianity, although it has not been perfect, has always given a level of credibility to women because it holds to this foundation that we are all created in the image of God.
Right. So, and let's give them credit for that. So within the community, they do that, and there's evidence for that. Why in the power structure did they not have that? Why was it all I mean, it still is.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nuns, but they don't have any power.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's I hold to a position of what's called complementarianism, that men and women have different roles, both in their genders and in the operation of the church, they are equal, but they complement each other in different ways. And so when you look at how Paul writes to the churches and says, hey, here's how the church structure should be operating. You have Christ as the head, and then you have elders and deacons. And he specifically says, those are men. Now, what that's not saying is that these are the most important people. And this is something that the Protestant Reformation, when they reformed the church, I think brought back to a level of, okay, we need to reevaluate this. We need to recalibrate this, because the priesthood has been elevated to something that it never should have been. And this is why you have in Protestantism, and even Protestants don't do this very well. There are lots of churches where you have celebrity pastorism. I would say that is actually anti-Protestant in the sense of historical Protestantism.
I mean, I think they're the worst people on the planet. Like anyone who, I mean, you see this latest one, they're like selling plots of land in heaven to people.
Oh yeah, that's just stupid.
Yeah, it's stupid. But I'm saying, like, people who bastardize what's such a well-intentioned thing that plays on people's ultimate question in life, which is the meaning of it and where it goes and what they do.
Right.
Special place in hell for you.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus warns against that in saying that there will be wolves among the sheep.
Yeah, that's
right.
absolutely
Wolves
right.
in sheep's clothing.
Good
he
warning,
specifically
Jesus.
says that and says there will be false prophets. In 1 John, it calls them the antichrists. Literally, we think of the antichrist, but really, scripturally, there are multiple antichrists in the sense that they are the opposite of what Jesus is actually teaching.
Right.
And I would say that a lot of these people, not everybody is a wolf in sheep's clothing, but there are some very overt wolves in sheep's clothing. But going back to what I was saying about women, is part of the problem of something like celebrity pastorism is that it makes it look like the end all and be all of the Christian community is the pastor. And that is not necessarily true. And I would actually say that when you look at how Scripture articulates the purpose and intention of women as people who both have the ability to procreate, to create other human beings,
right,
and then raise them to be things like good citizens and godly men and women, I would say that is actually potentially a more important role within the life of both Christian church and within society than anything like a pastor could ever be. Because the pastor is a shepherd, right? That's where the word in Latin, pastor, means shepherd, and that's where that comes from. But women have always been the current that sits at the heart of the structures of everyday life. And we see this even in the New Testament. When Peter writes, and there's a specific section where he says, hey, Christian women, if you have a husband who is not a Christian, you need to make sure that you are being an example to them, and you are being a wife that, up until the point of like being asked to do something which is like problematic and sinful, you need to show by example how you can lead the family. And we have lots of examples of this, of of converts who the wife comes to faith within the antiquity, and then the family follows suit afterwards, because women are such an integral point, and the normative position of a wife is to then be, the mother in that community. Obviously, there are caveats to that, and things happen, but the normative position of marriage is procreation and the furtherment of things like society.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I there's so much of, when you look at how society functions and what the role religion plays in that from a cultural aspect, it's impossible to deny how much that has rubbed off. Like, you can look at people now who, may not know anything about religion and aren't religious at all, and yet customs that they have practiced every day of their life are almost like direct descendants of what was perhaps within Christianity or within other religions as well, depending on where you live. Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.